19th of the 8th, 2013. Freezing cold. Still, if you're in a small apartment, easy to warm up. Just bang your arms and you're warm. Small space, instantly warm. I don't see what everyone's complaining about. There's big articles in the papers today and followed up online with the thought that micro apartments, I think we used to call them bedsits, now they're micro apartments, are really useful in the city. Or alternately, they're an eyesore and a blot on society in the city. This is teeny tiny spaces rented out, mainly to international students, but it could be to anyone. Colleen Peterson is sitting in front of me. She is a director, Ratio Consultants, Melbourne area, architecture and planning. What exactly does that mean? Let's find out. Hi, Colleen. Welcome
Hi, Richard. Thank you.
So you are Director Ratio Consultants, which is what?
We're a firm of town planning and traffic engineers, and we deal primarily with building approvals in Melbourne and Victoria.
Micro apartments are a trend in the world's western cities, and they're awesome because they solve that problem of density and space that you just should be allowed to pay for what you want, and therefore they're fantastic.
Well, in some respects, yes, but in other respects, no, Richard. It's like anything. It's about the quality of the design and the location. So there are certainly circumstances where the provision of small apartments can achieve a really useful outcome in terms of dwelling diversity, affordability and meeting supply. But there's also going to be circumstances where the location of those apartments and the quality of their overall outfit are not really suitable for the sort of living that we're wanting in today's society.
What makes a good one?
Well, it's really about having access to ventilation, access to natural light, and I think also about access to services and facilities. So being located within a vibrant precinct where residents will really make a conscious decision to trade off internal space within their home to have access to cafes, restaurants, public transport and their work.
Any of that backed up by any evidence? Who says how much natural light is what we need?
Well, there's some work within the Victorian building regulations and the planning guidelines such as Res Code that do give some guidance on the level of daylight and sunlight that's appropriate. I think it's fair to say that for taller high-rise buildings, there's probably a gap in the planning controls as to what would be an acceptable level.
Any other evidence that you're drawing on anywhere? Because you were just really definite about 3 points. And these tiny apartments exist in Europe. Is there any evidence in Europe about when they don't have enough light, it looks like this? When they don't have enough venting, whatever that is?
Well, that all really falls under the building regulations. So I'm certainly not familiar with work that's been done in Europe, but certainly familiar with work in Melbourne, and I've been involved in some applications
I get
for
the
small
laws,
ones. Yes.
But is there any reason for the laws? Any reason for the regulation based on evidence?
Well, the laws are about providing what's considered to be a basic level of amenity to make a dwelling fit for human habitation.
Okay. And are we basing those basic ideas about fit for human habitation on what?
Well, I think it's about evolution of acceptance. So there's very little in the way, for example, with regard to light, about a measurement, for example, a definitive measurement.
You know why I'm pinning you down on this? Because if I choose to live in an apartment that doesn't have as much light as you think I should have, who are you, or any other, you being any other organisation, to say, no, unless it's backed up with evidence? Isn't it just your opinion and I've got my opinion, so...
And that's right. And I mean, a classic example would be students. Students often make compromises in terms of the quality of their living quarters. We've all probably had experiences where we've lived in some very dodgy accommodation as students, and that's all part of the sort of growing up.
Yeah.
And it's an experience that we all share, and in hindsight we sort of joke and laugh about it, looking back.
We'll never do that again if we can avoid it.
That's right, but it's all character building at the time. So there is an element of that to it, but it's really about, I think, trying to protect the most vulnerable in society from the creation of really substandard housing.
That's kind of what we're terrified of here, isn't it? As I'm playing around trying to get you to tell me the evidence that backs the laws, the other thing that's in the background here is we're making tiny, minimal accommodation and charging a fortune for it, and setting up the equivalents of slums, little awful apartments of no amenity, and charging a fortune for them without any governance.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Richard, because the primary philosophy about providing small accommodation is about providing diversity and affordability. I must admit, in reading that article in the paper today, in The Age, I was quite surprised at the level of rents being charged for such small accommodation. Certainly in the work that I've done in the past in dealing with this sort of bedsit student housing type arrangement, is one would see accommodation in the order of, say, 20 to 30% cheaper than larger apartments. So, yeah, I was quite surprised to see that the levels of rent that they were charging.
Because it's location, right? It's right in the city, and it's this.
But ironically, rents in the city are actually relatively affordable, say, compared with other accommodation in the inner city.
We should talk about how tiny we're talking. The paper quotes the size of a standard car parking space. Studio flats for sale in central Melbourne and Footscray are as small as 15 square metres.
That's right. So student accommodation, and we should say, probably make it clear for the listeners that the type of accommodation that the paper is talking about today really focuses on international students and to a lesser degree Australian students. But there's been
But it'd be anyone, wouldn't it? It just so happens that they're the ones with the need. It's not like, sorry, we only rent to international students.
No, well, actually, that's exactly the case,
It'd be
Richard.
anyone.
No, the vast majority of these buildings are set up, designed specifically to cater for students. And there'll be restrictions in the leasing that you need to be a full-time student in order to reside there.
Interesting. Okay.
And so some of the tension that's resulting now is in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a significant number of buildings designed to cater primarily for international students, built in clusters around our tertiary institutions. So you'll see them in Box Hill, around Monash University,
MIT,
Melbourne, exactly. But with the lack of confidence in the Australian market for international students, we've obviously seen a significant fall-off, particularly in Indian student numbers. There's effectively a glut of student accommodation. And so what we're seeing now is investors in these buildings are now trying to find alternative means with which to get a return on their investment. And so we're seeing now buildings trying to convert from being exclusively for students to having a more broad appeal.
Yeah,
that's right.
Colleen Peterson's who you're chatting to. Colleen, from a planning point of view, is this our way forward? I know the model exists in Europe, but because it exists somewhere else, does that necessarily mean that we transfer it across?
Well, I think, again, it's about context. So while there are examples of this type of housing internationally, I think it's important to keep into perspective that it still represents a very small proportion of housing overall, just as the level of these types of small apartments would be a very small amount of housing in Melbourne. So I wouldn't see it being the solution for housing affordability throughout Melbourne per se, but for a small segment of the market, the provision of well-designed small apartments would achieve, a good place.
What if Japan more than Europe was an example of this kind of apartment living?
And that might be right.
Giant high-rises in Tokyo. I've been to them, rows upon rows of them, like giant Japanese robots of
it's
tiny
interesting
apartments.
Because in an Australian context, we don't often look to Asia as a comparison of livability, because it's generally perceived in Australia that Asian cities, and particularly high-density Asian cities, are not a benchmark that we wish to aspire to. As Australians, we tend to look more romantically to European cities such as Barcelona and Paris, and this concept of substantial development but within a 4 to 6 story physical framework, and that provides us with a romanticised vision of how Melbourne might be at a more densely developed form, but without any of the trappings of, significant overshadowing and the like that an overcrowding that you would see in Asian cities.
Whack your headphones on. Enza's on the road. Hey Enza, how are you?
Hi, how are you?
Very well, thanks. You teach architecture at RMIT?
I do, and I also practice as an architect.
And so were you desperate to jump on because you went, ooh, I've got evidence, because I was asking the question, what evidence are we backing our assumptions that you need a certain amount of light into apartments?
It's interesting. I've just submitted part of my postgraduate master's research at RMIT last Friday, and there's empirical data available, and it's called nature correctedness, and it's data that shows the physiological and psychological benefits of sunlight and air in our daily living. And some of the research I've done in the office shows that our city grid, comparable to, let's say, London's and New York's, is by far denser than any other grid, and compared to Shanghai as well. So that's what data makes us realise that the CBD in particular, with its high-rise residential living, in the future may have some critical impacts on the residents.
Does your data show us anything that is an impact of what happens to someone who doesn't have access to sufficient natural light?
It hasn't. No, that data hasn't come across. The physiological, like happiness, etc. But I've had a personal experience. My husband and I made that exact choice after working in Vietnam for 5 years to live in a large-scale apartment in the CBD, but with no direct sunlight at all. And my office is also situated in that apartment. And what happened after 2 years of living there is I had this chronic lack of vitamin D that put me into a state of depression.
Interesting.
And that's where the masters actually stemmed from, because I thought if we have this such as, us architects are responsible for the types of spaces that we design. So some apartments shouldn't be located on ground, second and third floor. And I'm talking about new, construction. So I think the planning laws need to reflect this. It's such a, new phenomena, Melbourneites living in the CBD.
Yeah, it's only relative. I can easily remember a time when no one lived in the CBD, and that was one of the features about Melbourne and made it so unusual as a city in the world.
That's ironically.
I was just going to say, what our data showed is our density is equivalent to that of Greater London in the CBD, in capital city zone.
Isn't it interesting, though, Enza is rung up, and you're also chatting with Colleen Peterson. Isn't it interesting that neither of you can say, yes, there's this evidence? I mean, we all think, I can understand why we'd say, oh, yeah, natural light's important, but there's no evidence to back it, and therefore it must be very hard to legislate an appropriate amount if it's based on what I reckon.
Well, I think the planning controls do legislate access to natural light and ventilation. That is all contained within the planning guidelines. Where it's ambiguous is how much particularly daylight's required for high-rise buildings. I think it's probably clear, should be made clear to say that contemporary apartment buildings, certainly that built in the last 10 to 15 years, generally have quite good access to daylight and sunlight. The challenges that we're getting in the very recent history is with the increase in multi-density and high-rise living, particularly in the CBD, of then subsequent buildings coming along wanting to build in very close proximity to existing windows. And that's where I think the real challenge is coming. But certainly the sort of student accommodation that I've personally seen over the last 5 or 10 years would have the sorts of access to light and ventilation comparable with most townhouses or medium-density development in the
I'll ask both of you, since I've got you both on the line. What should we make any law about how small you can make something, or should it just be, if I can design it, it should be built?
I don't think size matters. I think what matters is the quality of light, the quality of air, and the quality of views. And that's what the data that we've been looking at shows. But I think the other thing that we haven't legislated in Melbourne, it's such a new phenomenon that I understand why, is the vertical density. We don't say, okay, these two towers should not be next to each other because they're having an impact on your neighbour's amenity. Colleen, do you agree with that? That's what I would say the next point of legislation should be?
Oh, that's probably the biggest gap in planning policy in the current day, is this idea about equitable sharing of development, and that when one building is constructed, it needs to take into consideration the likely development of the adjoining block. And there are some councils that are trying to tackle that issue quite seriously, and the City of Moreland would probably be the front runner in that. They've developed a series of guidelines for high density development. It has still some way to go in terms of being approved, but it shows that there is starting to be some serious discourse about that particular issue.
I think the greatest anomaly really is situated in the CBD, in capital city zone, where legislation allows for, the local authority to be bypassed, given a certain square meterage per development. And I think that was a great policy for postcode 3000, but I'm not so sure that it's the appropriate policy for this day and age.
It's really interesting, and I'm getting lots of SMSs too about along the theme of how can we attract international students if we exploit them as soon as they get here with our accommodation. Students on visas far from home are surely better off under the supervision and structured regime of a university college or hall of residence than the loneliness of a high-rise cubby house. That's Chris in St Albans, and of course we've allowed the private sector to do it rather than develop up university models that could perhaps accommodate more.
I think there's a couple of things there that a comment like that probably fails to understand. And the first is there's a significant difference in price between attending a university college as opposed to living in a specifically designed
because
university.
we kept the model that way.
That's right. And so part of this is about affordability.
Yeah.
But I think, too, people also probably fail to understand the sense of community that can be developed within these student accommodation buildings. There are shared communal spaces that do provide a focal point for students to live. And that's not to say that that's a foolproof guarantee, but there are opportunities for communities to be developed within the buildings themselves.
Seems like we missed an opportunity, a fork in the road. We could have changed the model of colleges and halls of residence that were in there since the 50s or 40s and changed it for the new international students, but rather we let the market sort it out. We kept the halls of residence because it's too costly and there's a lot of money and blah. So we let the market decide. I'm getting all sorts of SMSs. Building regulations are statutory rules passed down from the Building Act. The Building Act is law. Evidence is not needed to warrant rules, laws. Ignorance doesn't suit you. Research. Yeah, thanks for the shout. That's not what I'm saying. Yes, everything you're saying is right, but I'm saying, and where did the size and measurements of that law come from? Were they erect or plucked by someone who wrote the law, or were they based on any kind of evidence? Evidence is not needed to warrant rules and laws, of course not. But are they just random numbers picked oddly, or were they based off any kind of research? Why are they that size, not another size? That's what I'm asking. So it's a fascinating conversation. Colleen Peterson's here, and thank you, Enza, for calling in as well. You get off and hand in that Masters, which is weird. That just happened on the Friday. 774 ABC Melbourne.
774 ABC Melbourne's Facebook page lets you keep up with what's happening on air.
Even when you can't tune in to the radio.
At work, on the train, in the queue at the bank.
If you're near a computer, tablet or smartphone, you can share your opinion, ask a question, tell a story.
And continue the conversation even when the topic changes on air.
Like us to see us in your newsfeed and stay up to date when you're on Facebook.
Just search for 774 ABC Melbourne, but don't turn the radio off.
Call now on 1300 222 774.
Or SMS 0437 774 774.
You're with Richard Stubbs
on 774 ABC Melbourne.
1:28. In all sorts of ways, the city is looked at as accommodation, whereas perhaps 30 years ago it certainly wasn't. Now it is for both transitory accommodation for international students who are here for a year or a couple of years, and also a permanent place for people to live. All sorts of things are a knock-on from that, or anywhere really where there's a demand for space. Micro apartments are what we're talking about. They're small. 15 square metres is a micro flat apartment. They wedge a little kitchenette into that. They wedge a bathroom into that. And then there's a bedroom, sitting room, but not much space for anything. I would instantly be a hoarder if I lived in that space. Don't you think, Colleen? Could you imagine yourself?
Well, I think the biggest challenge for these apartments is storage and making sure that the apartments are really smartly designed to make the most out of every single square metre. And I think the best analogy I can think of is going into an IKEA store and you look at the little apartments that they have set up there and they can get 2-bedroom apartments in 40 square metres.
See, I would have thought going into a caravan or, a mobile home, one of those ones where you're driving around, camper van. Sorry, I lost the word there for a sec. Walking into those kind of spaces is more what the design's going to be like because they're tiny and around the same space.
Oh, that's right. But I guess the analogy I was trying to make was that it's about being really smart with a sense of space, and ultimately the accommodation in these small apartments is designed primarily for people who will be not entertaining at home. It's for obviously single-person households where there's a focus on providing a place for people to sleep and eat, but that their entertaining is done elsewhere.
Did you ever go to the Pompeii exhibition when it was out here?
No, I didn't. No.
You so should have. One of the reasons that you would have enjoyed it is to look at the Roman Suburia, the suburb. And the Romans lived in high-rise apartments that had a very basic kitchen, but they didn't have any laundry services. And down below in the bottom of the apartments were the restaurant, laundry, communal stuff. And that's how they lived in the inner city. And
that's a very similar concept to what student housing is, where there are community facilities downstairs, there'll be a communal laundry, there's often commercial uses at ground level, so whether it's a cafe, restaurant, a convenience store, and that really the apartments themselves are somewhere really to sleep and study. And in my opinion, that type of accommodation can still work quite effectively for young people and particularly people on low incomes, where they can have access to accommodation in our vibrant centres and be close to areas, whether it be the CBD, Chapel Street, Brunswick Street, where a lot of young people aren't interested in cooking and having dinner parties. That's something that comes with age and fatigue. And, they're not wanting to pay for accommodation that they don't need.
All sorts of SMSs. Prison cells. There's the minimum standard, tons of research, etc. Yeah, to give you an idea, maximum security cell at Barwon prisons quoted here is 8 square metres. The smallest caravan you can get is about 12, almost 13 square metres. A micro flat type apartment around 15 square metres. And 15 would be the lowest that I've ever seen. They mostly sit around 19 to 20 square metres. Which is about 25% bigger than a car park space. Well, it's interesting. Car park space are about 14.2. Well, they're actually about 12, so I'm not quite sure where they got the dimensions from. Yeah, so a regulation car parking space is 2.6 by 4.9, and that comes out to, I think it's 11.98 square metres. So it's a generous car park that they're using. I'll get you to throw your headphones back on. You can add in this conversation, which is, I think, conversation about the micro apartment, the effects of light and air on the way you live. I was just saying, is there any evidence, anything at all that tells us what we all think we know? We know that this SMS, not enough natural light, can cause depression. Yep, we know that. But is there any evidence for how much? How big a window does it need to be before it was fine? Sue's pointing out windows were taxed in the 19th century, so builders didn't put them in. So don't necessarily look to history or tradition for good laws on building practice. Well, that's true. I'm fighting a VCAT decision that takes my sunlight against local regulations. I feel it violates my daughter's human rights as someone with a disability who also suffers from vitamin D deficiency and battles depression. It's really interesting. What a complex argument to be running. Bill's in Melbourne. Hi, Bill. What made you jump on the phone to join in this conversation?
Richard, I'm a veterinarian and a farmer and background in animal welfare, and in Europe, particularly in the Scandinavian countries, there's actually legislation, or there has been in the past, requiring that animals that are normally housed through the winter to have a certain amount of time out in the so-called sunlight or daylight, even during the coldest winter days in Scandinavia. Because of the effects on their mental health? No, it's primarily, as I understand it, related to vitamin D deficiency. Okay. And the clinical vitamin D deficiency, which, amongst other things, can show up as weak bones. And also, I guess, does affect mental health, but they're a long way around. But it's a vitamin D deficiency. So what's your link here? What's the point you want to make about micro apartments in the city and other close to the CBD areas? Well, the link is that you were raising the question, what underpins the requirements or perceived need for requirements for daylight, and I'm giving you an example of in Scandinavia, it's actually been put into law for animals because of, I believe, some reasonable scientific basis, particularly related to vitamin D deficiency and the ill health that can cause. Yeah, it's interesting. Thanks, Bill. Quite a few people are mentioning Scandinavia. Ship's cabins when you're on a cruise are bigger than what you're talking about. That's Kevin in North Eltham. That's exactly right. This one, it's pretty basic, really. The more we jam into our city, the smaller the living spaces will be. Overpopulated cities are never healthy places. Is there something to that, Colleen, do you think? As designers, do we just go, well, we're building tall buildings right next to each other. They're all going to impinge on each other. That's why they're not millions of dollars for these apartments. You pay for what you get. Bad luck. Well, I think there's perhaps some confusion about micro apartments equal poor access to light, and there's no correlation between the two per se. Any dwelling, whether it be a small apartment or a townhouse or a penthouse, consideration has to be given to access to natural light and sunlight. So I don't think one can necessarily equate this type of accommodation with poor access to light. There may be a legacy from the 70s and 80s of poor levels of daylight in these types of buildings, but certainly not in the contemporary world. Okay. Although that is the risk, though, isn't it? Isn't it, as more of these are built? It's a risk for any building, so not just micro apartments. I think to exclusively say that it's but in a micro apartment you've only got one wall. In another building you've got other
you've got lots of ways to let in light. In a micro apartment, you've got one wall.
Except that in most high-rise buildings, depending on the size and orientation of the block, you'll get many apartments that will only have one access to light, and they'll be still single-bedroom apartments, but they might be 50 or 60 square metres in size. So it's not an issue just for micro apartments, it's for high-rise living across metropolitan Melbourne.
It's interesting. Interesting discussion, and the idea that, okay, because I was thinking in my head, yes, you're quite right, I can see that in my mind's eye, but if the wall is tiny, your opportunity for a window is
But what you'll find is that entire wall will then become a window. The minimum requirements, believe it or not, for daylight or for a window is 10% of the floor area of the room in question.
Okay.
So, for example, for a 15 square metre apartment, it would need to have a 1.5 square metre window, which is actually a reasonable size window.
I'll just show the picture that was in the paper. Is that the same size you're talking about?
Look, that I would have thought a window slightly on the smaller size, and I would think that is an older apartment building that resident is living in. Certainly the buildings that I've been involved with and inspected over the last 5 or 10 years would have extensive windows and in fact would have balconies off them. So the windows would often be 2.5 to 2.8 metres in height and would be maybe 4 or 5 metres in across the full width of the room. And so that obviously...
I'm still spinning out at the thought of the balcony. As someone who doesn't like heights and feels crammed in, the idea of going out on a teeny tiny balcony up really high makes me want almost fall over. Pete's in Brunswick. Hi, Pete.
Hi, Richard. Hi. We've got some experience with this. Recently, we had a development application go through in our street about a year ago.
In Brunswick?
Yeah, in Brunswick. It's a little pocket down the south end, and it hasn't really been developed at all yet. So we saw it it was like a precedent for us. It was 5 stories high, and they had 52 apartments. The average size was 18 square metres. And the real issue for us was the parking, because there was only 2 car parks for 52 apartments. We ended up taking them to VCAT, but part of the process was the developer did a demonstration on how you could live in 18 square metres. It was actually quite comical because after you've put the bathroom in and the kitchen area, cooking area, and a bed, there was a 1 metre by 2 metres that was left for eating and for sitting. And the woman said, well, you know, IKEA have these wonderful fold-up tables and chairs that you could use, and you just fold them away. But I don't know about you, Richard. I don't know if I could live in 1 metre by 2 metres.
See, that's what we're talking about now. When you and I say, well, we couldn't do that, that doesn't mean that someone else couldn't. Well, how many people were they thinking would go in each of these apartments?
Well, they put it, I think this is also part of the problem, that the developer put it through under student accommodation, and that was all fine, but then later took it back through Moreland Council to change the student accommodation. So basically it can be rented to anybody. And I just cannot see how that size, that footprint, 18 square metres, is actually habitable. I mean, at VCAT they said, well, students come and go. They're probably only there for 6 months, which is fine. But once you take the student accommodation out of the equation, you've got people actually living in these things.
Which is what Colleen was pointing to. The fall-off in international students meant that suddenly developers were stuck with these teeny tiny apartments and they've got to sell them to the general public.
That's right.
To the cash strapped, possibly, and you go and live in smaller ones. Or this is going to make me go, Richard, micro flats, perfect for CBD nookie at lunchtimes. Ew, Kim, ew. And they also make good family tombs. That's from Tone. Yeah, thank you. Colleen, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating conversation. Colleen Peterson, from Director at Ratio Consultants, Australian Architecture and Planning. This is her meat and potatoes, this kind of thing, a town planner with more than 20 years' experience now.
That'll be me, yes.